We are here today to present Undercover Advocate, Building a Trauma-Informed Police Agency Culture. And with this training, we are hoping to explore how to build strong foundations for advocacy within police departments so we can create a really lasting impact, not only on investigative practices, but also on agency culture and ultimately community trust. So with that, we want to explore the core of who advocates are, what they do, how they can best serve as the secret superpower, not only for sex crimes investigations, but actually for police agency culture. And we want to talk with all of you today about some of the benefits and challenges that you are seeing within your agencies and with advocacy, and learn how to use it internally as a foundation to make your agency stronger. And next slide. All right. So I'm Kristen Daly. I am co-founder of K Training and Consulting. I'm a credentialed victim advocate, and I'm the executive director of New Blue, which is a nonprofit incubator for police community co-created projects. And I will pass it over to my K Training and Consulting co-founder, Kenny Smith.
Hey guys, Kenny Smith. Yes, I'm also the co-founder of K Training and Consulting along with Kristen. I also work full-time for the Arkansas Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I am their law enforcement training director and the COSAR program director for them. And for us in Arkansas, COSAR is kind of the equivalent of having a SART team, if you guys are familiar with SART teams. And so that's my day job, I guess. But super excited to be here with you guys. My background is in law enforcement. I started off in 1997, working as a corrections officer, and then worked my way up. Went to the police academy. I've been a patrol officer, a detective, worked in the administration, and took a semi-early retirement, I guess, from at least full-time law enforcement at the end of 2018 to go work for a CASA. And so I really enjoy the work that I get to do, and get to meet wonderful people such as yourselves all across the country. And in fact, this is how Kristen and I actually met, was at a conference. And so now here we are training together. So you never know who you're going to meet and what kind of doors may be opened up. Before we get into today, though, we have a small enough group that I would love just to take just a minute and let you guys introduce yourselves as well, and what kind of work that you guys are doing there back in. I'm assuming maybe everyone's from Oregon. I'm not for sure, but if you guys want to introduce yourselves and just kind of tell us where you're from.
I'll start that. I'm Jen Wallace, and I am exploring my involvement with the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. And I was formerly the program manager of sexual assault investigations at the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. And I also have a consulting firm. So, mix of interest and reasons that I'm here today.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.
My name's Amber. I am a detective with Albany Police Department here in Oregon and primarily investigate crimes against children, so a lot of child sex abuse, but also any major cases or adult sexual assault cases. Um, I've been in this position for about 8 years, and this actually came to me. One of our SANE nurses inquired about my interest in joining the sexual assault task force, and so I signed up for this as kind of just some information. And I'm eager to learn more and learn more about all of the resources available.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, love having both of you here today. I thought we had a third one. I guess they might have had to drop off there, but
Oh, I'm here.
oh, you're here. Perfect. Thank you. I couldn't see you on my screen. Thank you.
That's okay. My name is Katrina Rodriguez. I am the Victim Services Coordinator here at the Beaverton Police Department. I have been here in my role for 14 years. I serve victims of all types of crime. And I apologize, but we have several things that are going on right now. So I have my headphones in, but I'm walking around and I'm going to be kind of mobile and in and out, but trying to listen with as much ear as I can.
Oh, absolutely.
Don't apologize.
Glad that you're here.
Yes.
And then I think, Kenny, we have one more. Kristen Dewey just joined us. And
Great,
Kristen,
great.
are you available to do a little intro? No worries if not. Oh, her mic is not set up. Okay. Kristen Dewey, she'll switch to a laptop shortly. So when we see her, we'll be able to do a little intro then. Thank you,
Perfect.
Kristen.
Perfect. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and hop in, and then when Kristen gets set up, we can hear from her in just a moment. But so today, our mission is to kind of explain the critical role of what advocates do within a multidisciplinary approach, and how to cultivate that within your agency. This is probably going to be old hat for a lot of you because it looks like we've got someone who is working in system advocacy right now for 14 years. So you might be, I mean, chime in anytime if you want to teach the class. I mean, because you've got a lot of experience. So, super glad that you're here. And we've also got detectives. We've got all sorts of different roles, and so you guys may be familiar with a lot of this. But hopefully, with the differences between law enforcement and advocacy, hopefully today we can kind of bridge that gap and understand how to work together more effectively. And if you're in law enforcement now and do not have system-based advocacy, this might be something that you can pick up something to bring back and hopefully get one started in your agency. So we want to identify some of the challenges that are associated with this, as well as we want to explore how advocacy can actually strengthen the investigative process and build community trust. And so these are the three primary goals that we have for today that we're going to kind of dive into. So I wanted to just kind of start with just defining what is an advocate. And for me, Kristen is my go-to. My expertise is in law enforcement. Kristen is my partner. She is a credentialed advocate. And so I wanted to ask you, Kristen, could you help us to understand what is an advocate?
To me, I would define advocacy in the system as supporting victims or survivors, especially in the cases of sensitive crimes like sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse. Advocates provide emotional support. They guide victims or survivors through the legal process, and they help them to access really necessary services like healthcare, legal aid, counseling, any services that they might need in navigating the healing process.
So that kind of answers second question as well as to why advocacy is important, just based on what you just said there. But more specifically, why would you say that system-based advocacy is so important?
I would say it's really important because, and Katrina, I see your comment. Yes, absolutely. Safety planning is a huge part of what advocates do, and we will definitely dig into that a bit later. But advocacy provides an agency with a victim-centered approach that promotes compassion, promotes trust in law enforcement, helps to sort of bridge the gap between the victim survivor and the police officer investigator. It really helps, especially in marginalized communities where community members might be hesitant or afraid to come to the police, afraid of the reporting process. It's really, the advocate serves as a guide to help them navigate of all of what can be a very complicated or complex process.
So, in general, I understand advocacy and I understand the role of the advocate. How does that work in practice? Like, how do you actually implement that into a law enforcement agency or as a nonprofit?
In the simplest terms, advocates work alongside investigators to ensure the victim's emotional and psychological needs are met, and their basic needs are met, their safety planning needs are met throughout the investigation process. And then this collaborative approach really improves outcomes for both the victim survivors and law enforcement, in that it builds up a sense of trust and safety and allows investigators to pull more of the information that they need to actually solve the case.
Awesome. All right. So I'd like to kind of turn it to our audience for a second. In your own experiences, how has advocates helped in investigations or in communicating with your community? Can you share some personal examples, some cases that maybe you guys have interacted with, or some observations that you may have had?
I'll just, I don't know that I have a specific example. So we have CASA, which I think Kristen is actually, or I'm sorry, CARDFA. Kristen that's on is a part of that. So we communicate, excuse me, with them on sexual assault cases. And oftentimes they have advocates that respond to our examination center and our advocates from the very, very beginning, which is super helpful. And we have an in-house advocate as well. They work for the police department, and so they work on cases, primarily misdemeanors, not felony cases. But we also then have a district attorney's office where they have victim advocates. So we have all of these different organizations with people in advocacy roles. And we all kind of take a part of that. As a detective, I mean, my title is not an advocate, but we've become pretty close with the families that we serve. And so oftentimes I'm in that role myself. And I have found that that can sometimes be challenging because it doesn't always align with the investigation. And there's information that I can share as an investigator, or in that role as an advocate, but not vice versa, if that makes sense. So sometimes those blurred lines can become really complicated in a criminal proceeding. So it's so helpful to have our advocates that can work directly with our victims or our families and be able to kind of redirect families to them for certain types of questions to alleviate any conflicts later on. I'll be honest, it's difficult for me to let go of some of that on cases, but I'm so appreciative when we have advocates who are actually involved and invested with our families. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, sometimes those roles, while they're two separate things, sometimes there's a lot of commonality and it's hard to distinguish, where the line is on that. It's very difficult. So, but thank you. Anybody else?
I would just sum up in working with police officers that, they tend to keep the victim engaged in a very daunting and not very trauma-informed criminal justice process. And we all know that without victim engagement, the likelihood of that case outcomes being effective or, prosecute that individual being held accountable really diminish without their involvement.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, you just made my heart really happy by saying victim engagement, not victim cooperation. So thank you. I love that. So yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. I'll tell you guys from my own personal experience working in rural Arkansas in law enforcement. I've worked in a part of the state here that there was no victim advocacy, like it did not exist. And then I've worked in a part of the state where we had advocacy organizations, not system-based advocacy, but community-based advocacy that served multiple counties. And as a police officer, working in patrol and as a detective, I can tell you the difference is night and day. Having an advocate present versus not having an advocate present, whether it be at the hospital, taking an initial police report, or through the investigative process, it is night and day having an advocate present. So, so thankful that we have advocates, and thank you all for being on the call with us.
I do think also, Kenny, someone dropped something in the chat, if it's okay if I read it.
Yes, please, because I cannot see chat.
No,
so.
totally. That's why I wanted to.
Yes, just about to point that
out. Katrina dropped in the chat, I think one of the most critical of the many aspects of law enforcement-based advocates is that we're able to respond as quickly as officers/detectives, or very soon after, typically much faster than DA office-based advocates. This can make a huge difference in supporting trauma, decreasing anxiety, and getting survivors or resources to survivors. Thank you so much for naming that, Katrina. And I do think we have Tara that also joined us during that. So I wanted to name. We've got a few new folks on.
Awesome. Welcome.
All right. So now we want to get a little bit into the core of what advocacy is and what advocates actually do. So I would say some of the key responsibilities of what advocates do are emotional support, Advocates provide trauma-informed care to victim survivors. They ensure that they feel as safe and supported as possible throughout the reporting and investigative process. They are there to answer questions. They are there to guide, and they're there to, as Katrina mentioned earlier, safety plan, which is particularly important in cases of domestic or intimate partner violence, where the victim might need, immediate basic needs taken care of, like housing needs, or any survivor that might want access to therapy or immediate care. Advocates really help to safety plan around holistic needs for every victim survivor. The second critical piece of what advocates do is guidance through the legal process. They explain legal rights, they explain the investigative process, the reporting process, and they help victims to navigate these systems that can be very complicated and complex to anyone, but particularly someone who has been through potentially the worst day of their life, and they don't really want to try to guide themselves through this process. Advocates are there every step of the way. The third would be resource coordination. So advocates connect victims to medical services, therapy, legal representation, support groups, a whole host of resources based in the community that the survivor may not have immediate means to look up or access. So advocates really provide that sense of security in knowing that you'll get exactly the care that you need.
Yeah. So I also want to kind of go back and readdress real quickly. This was mentioned just a little bit ago about the role between an advocate and the role of a law enforcement officer, because those two things are not all encompassing necessarily. So, the role of a law enforcement officer, our job is to collect evidence and investigate the case, right? Versus the role of the advocate is there to support the survivor. Their focus is solely on what is best for the survivor through this process. And so there's a lot of good things that can come out of that. And I don't want to spoil the next couple of slides by talking about all of it now, but one of those things would be that as an investigator, I have found that we actually get more information, we get more investigative evidence, having an advocate present more often than not. And we see that because when the advocate is present, our survivor feels much more supported. They feel much more emboldened, if you will, or have more courage to be able to speak openly than maybe they would if it was just me as a police officer speaking to the survivor. And so we oftentimes see more information, more evidence, or deeper information being shared when an advocate is actually present. So those things are very, very important. We'll talk more about that as the presentation goes on as well. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is having a multidisciplinary approach with this. So you guys have mentioned a sexual assault task force. Is that equivalent to like a SART team there in Oregon, or is that a different setup?
That is my nonprofit organization that I work for. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
But each
Okay.
county has their own SART that is headed by a DA.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. So, and so talking about like a multidisciplinary approach, SART teams here in Arkansas, we call it a co-SART team, which is essentially a SART team. The biggest difference for us is that we added a community element to it, and so we don't have just law enforcement, prosecutors, medical, and advocacy sitting at the table. We actually opened ours up more to where we have community stakeholders sitting at the table as well. And the general idea behind that is that when we talk about things like sexual violence and human trafficking and domestic violence, those are community-based issues. And it requires the entire community understanding, being aware, and supportive of the processes to combat those things. And so, but advocacy is a huge piece of that multidisciplinary approach, as well as law enforcement, and they're all have their own equal roles there. But advocacy plays a huge part in that.
And I would also just add that, addressing sexual violence cases comes with a lot of layers, and advocates work within all of those layers. So the safety planning, filing protection orders, helping survivors deal with kind of the emotional fallout, all at the same time balancing those practical needs. Police and advocates and medical staff can work really well together in a multidisciplinary approach to create sort of a holistic wraparound response for victim survivors. And the really critical piece of that is that advocates can model specialized expertise that police departments may not inherently provide officers. So advocates can do a lot of things within the agency or as community-based advocates that police just may not have the knowledge or resources to know. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and advocates are there to provide that expertise. And that ultimately just leads us all to more successful investigations and prosecutions.
Absolutely. I can think of times where cases, I should say, where we had a law enforcement officer that responded to the ER to take a report. There was an advocate present, thank goodness, because the law enforcement officer was not well trained and was not trauma informed and was making victim blaming statements in regards to the victim's clothing, for example. And the advocate was very professional, was very courteous to the officer, but was able to kind of correct the language in front of the survivor. And the officer picked up on that correction and was like, oh, I didn't think of it that way, and was able to kind of switch gears and become much more trauma informed during the time that he was there, just because of that interaction with that advocate. So lots of great examples that we could give as far as that teamwork that could happen. I saw something go off in the chat. Did I miss anything or?
So
Yeah, I was just curious, when you say that you have community stakeholders as part of your SART, are you referring to like citizens or other organizations or both? And then if so, like, how did you advertise to gain that participation?
Yeah. So that's a whole nother class that we can get into, but so I don't want to take too much time. But to answer your question, that's a great question. So ours is kind of we've got layers, if you will. So for example, we do not have community members sitting on case review committees and things of that nature, but we have a general community program that all of those stakeholders, all the main players come to as far as service providers, and then our community members. So community members are everything from just concerned citizens who want to get involved. We purposely seek out business owners, clergy, different elements of leadership, if you will, in a community. So mayors and city council members and things of that nature. We kind of advertise to all of those folks to bring them to the table just to get a good rounded picture of that community. And so we pay a lot of attention to underserved populations within a community to make sure that their voices being heard and that their community is being represented. But so we kind of have that big community meeting, if you will. Most of the time, those are done once a month to once a quarter, just depending on where they are. But then we have our individual kind of committee meetings as well. That's a little bit more specialized. And so for those are really more service provider, more SART team kind of geared, where we're really kind of getting into the meat of things. But the community element is much more for community support, community awareness, education, and things of that nature.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want us to think about an investigation that you yourself have been involved with at whatever level. And how did an advocate help improve the outcome or make the process more victim-centered? I gave an example a while ago of an officer that showed up to the ER who was not necessarily trauma-informed, but become trauma-informed, at least momentarily, while they were in the moment. Could you think of some examples that you guys have experienced as well?
One thing, hi, my name is Kristen. I'm an advocate. I've been an advocate for about 17 years. Fortunately, I get to work with Amber Lovejoy, so it's great to see her here. But one kind of creative thing we've started to do with law enforcement is something called an information report. So very often as advocates, we work with survivors that are unsure if they want to officially report to police or not. But we've started teaming up with our local law enforcement agencies where the survivor can come in, put the person's name on record, put their their report on record and ask that, they're adult survivors, but ask that law enforcement does not investigate and just holds that as a record. And so often that is what the plan is, but then once the survivor actually gets in and starts talking to the officer and they're feeling safe and they're feeling supported and they're feeling believed, then it often changes to a reporting investigation. So that's something that we've kind of had success with recently.
Awesome.
That's a fantastic example. Yeah, I mean, the key is really building trust, and I think you named it perfectly, that people come in skeptical of the process, and if they're treated in a way that fosters, dignity and respect, they become more open to going through the steps of reporting, because they do have more faith in the process. That perfectly said.
Anyone else think of any other examples? All right. We will move on to the next slide then. So getting into talking about unique benefits of having an advocate. I mentioned this one a while ago, this trauma-informed approach about how the role of an advocate being there in an interview room or at the hospital allows the victim to feel safe, which leads to having more accurate and more, or at least increased evidence. More statements may be made. That holds true more often than not. One of the things that I've learned through that process is not only do they help them feel safe, but if you have an officer who is not trauma informed, especially as an investigator, when you're sitting down to do an investigative interview, which can be very, very lengthy, if that investigator is not trauma informed, they may try to work through really hard moments where the victim, or I'm sorry, the survivor may need to take a break. But they keep pushing and they keep pushing and they keep pushing because they think that they're making breakthrough based on the reaction that they're getting from that survivor. But in reality, the survivor is shutting down. They're getting less information. And so having an advocate there who is trauma informed, who understands that and can say, hey, can we take a break for just a moment? We just need to get a breath of fresh air. We need to use the restroom, need to get a drink of water, whatever the case may be. That actually helps to increase the information that officer is going to get at the end of the day.
Another really important piece of what advocates can add to an agency, Kenny mentioned a bit earlier with the COSAR model, building trust with the community. So advocates can really act as that bridge between police and community, build trust, especially with marginalized or vulnerable populations. And we mentioned a bit earlier, some people may go into the process afraid to contact the police at all, afraid to go through the steps of reporting, afraid to get involved in the system in any way. And advocates can serve as that, guide and kind of bring them through the process without them feeling intimidated, scared. I think we do need to kind of acknowledge that some people, some communities are much more disproportionately impacted by the justice system than others, and that can naturally lead to skepticism about the process. And the last thing that we want as practitioners is for anyone to feel like they would want to take steps toward justice, but are facing a roadblock because they're afraid to go to the police. So advocates can really help build that sense of trust and security. And as Kristen mentioned a bit earlier, they may start out the process just kind of dipping a toe in and end up saying, yeah, you know what, I think I can do this. I want to do this. And, that's, I think, an ideal outcome for not only the survivor, but for the larger community and for law enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really happy a while ago, as I mentioned, the word engagement versus the word cooperation. So that to kind of talk a little bit more about that, that's one of the things that I train law enforcement officers about all the time is that because I hear those phrases, I hear law enforcement say, well, The victim, they're not being cooperative. They won't cooperate with the investigation. And I always have to kind of stop them and question them, like, tell me more about cooperative. What do you mean they're not cooperating? What do you mean by that? And more often than not, what their definition of the survivor not cooperating is that they're shutting down. They don't want to, they're not sharing their experience with us. And I kind of let them know that, look, just because a survivor is not ready to share their experience, or maybe they're not ready to open up fully and share their experience with you, doesn't mean that they're not cooperating with you. It just means that they're not ready to engage at this point. And that's a huge difference, especially when you go to a prosecutor and to a jury trial, and those words of being uncooperative are starting to get thrown around, and it makes our survivors look bad. And so words are powerful. Again, we have a whole other presentation on language that we would love to do sometime with you, but having the victim feel heard and supported, that is a huge superpower that our advocate has. Because if they don't feel heard and they don't feel supported, they're not going to engage, or at least they're not going to engage fully. And so having that sense of security, having that support system there with them, allows them to feel heard, allows them to feel empowered to be able to engage in this system and be able to share the information more freely. And so that's a huge superpower that advocates have, that law enforcement, our hands are kind of bound by sometimes.
Yeah, and I think a really important piece here, and I know we're preaching to the choir a bit because we've got a lot of advocates in the room, but the advocate's sole agenda is supporting the survivor, helping them navigate what they want to do, what they want out of the process, what will best enable them to start the healing process. So advocates are really the rulers of trauma-informed response. Things you will never hear an advocate say: you need to make a report, you need to press charges, you need to give me every detail in chronological order, you need to answer why you did this, why you wore that, why you drank that much. All of these questions shut people down. And I think we have to acknowledge that all plays an enormous role in preventing re-traumatization of a person who has already been through something that no one should ever have to go through. So all of that is to say that the advocate's role here is really essential. It's not an optional thing.
Yeah. So I'd like to give you guys a scenario real quickly. So Detective Sarah Mitchell sat across from Emily Thompson. Emily's reluctance to engage was obvious and set Sarah on edge, knowing that she was not getting the information necessary to move the case forward. Each question Sarah asked was met with monosyllabic. Maybe you put that word in there and maybe try to say that word, Kristen? That's not very nice of you. Monosyllabic. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Responses or uncomfortable silences. Emily's eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact, and her hands fidgeted nervously. Sarah had encountered victims who were hesitant to speak, but Emily's demeanor was different. There was a palpable tension in the air. Sarah's frustration grew. She had been trained to handle a variety of cases, but the complexities of domestic violence were proving to be a formidable challenge. The lack of cooperation from Emily hindered the investigation, and Sarah began to question her approach. What should Sarah do next?
I suppose I would simply ask this victim, what, if anything, we could do to make her more comfortable.
Yeah.
Be a good start.
Yeah. One thing that pops out at me here is that right now, Emily doesn't have a advocate present, right? So we can start by asking if she needs a support system or would like to have a support system there. That's one of those things that, in law enforcement training, I have to make sure that I train law enforcement officers. That's one of the first steps that we want to make sure that we offer a support system. Two things that go along with that. Number one, if you're going to ask if they want to have an advocate present, law enforcement needs to understand what an advocate is, because a lot of people don't necessarily know what an advocate is until it's time that they need an advocate. And so law enforcement needs to be prepared to be able to answer the question of, well, would you like to have an advocate here? Here's how they can help you. And then secondly, we also have to realize that an advocate being a third neutral party into this process is also a stranger. And so there's a lot of individuals, at least in the forefront, may not want that. And so is it okay if they say, I don't want an advocate, but I want my sister to be here or my best friend to be here? Can they also serve as an advocate? And the answer is yes. Obviously, we would much prefer to have a certified, advocate who's trauma informed and knows what they're working through. But a support system is a support system to that survivor at that moment. And so it is okay to have that support system there.
Absolutely.
Any other suggestions on what Sarah should do in this situation?
I just wanted to add what you said, also knowing the name of the advocate and like having some experience working with the advocate can go a really long way. And just saying, oh, there's this organization over here, they do this, they support victims, just that personal contact, I would think would be really important.
Yes,
Yeah,
no, absolutely.
building relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I like to do, so I teach at a lot of our police academies, and I tell those rookie officers at the academy, on your own time, like if it's on shift, that's fine, but take the time to go to those organizations, introduce yourself, give them your card, and let them, learn more about who they are. Those advocates are going to be your best friend at 3 o'clock in the morning when you need someone. And so like take the time, go learn about who they are and what the work that they do, their staff and all of that. And then on the flip side of that, I always tell the same thing to the advocates when we have core advocacy training. I always like, you take the first step, go introduce yourself to the law enforcement agency. They're not going to come to you, go to them, introduce yourself. And so hopefully between the two of them, someone goes into somebody's offices and introduces themselves and hands off a card somewhere. But yeah, absolutely, Jen. Having that personal connection to services, to service providers, advocacy, is huge. It makes a big difference when you can say, "Look, I know Jen over at this organization. She's a wonderful advocate. She will be a huge help, a huge support system for you through this process." Versus, I can call this number and see, if they got someone available to come out here and not know anything about the organization. So that's a big difference. All right, we'll move on to the next slide.
All right. So here we're going to dive a little deeper into what Sarah actually did. It became evident that Emily needed more than just an investigation. She needed support. Recognizing this, Detective Mitchell reached out to Hope Haven, a local organization specializing in assisting survivors of domestic violence. There she met Rachel Adams, a credentialed advocate. Rachel connected Emily with a network of support, ensuring she received medical care, therapy, and legal assistance. Working with Rachel, Emily felt empowered and able to trust the process a bit more. As the investigation progressed, Detective Mitchell observed Emily's transformation. She spoke with conviction and felt ready to move forward with bringing her abuser to justice. Through this experience, Detective Mitchell learned invaluable lessons in trauma-informed care. She understood the importance of compassion, patience, and the need for a holistic approach when working with survivors. This case not only changed Emily's life, but also reshaped the way that Detective Mitchell viewed her role in the justice system.
Any discussion or conversation about that, how that followed through? Okay. All right, then we'll move on to building advocacy into our police culture. There are three primary steps that we look at when we talk about building the advocacy into the police culture. And the first one of those is training itself. And so our recommendation is always going to be to contact K Training Consulting. We have lots of training that we can provide. And I'm kidding, just a shameless plug. But training is huge. Training is absolutely huge. In my opinion, it's step number one for a reason. When we talk about training in my context is more so on the law enforcement side of things, because that's what I do is the law enforcement training. But, I can tell you from my own history, when I went to the police academy, for example, and I won't mention what year that was in, but when I went to the academy, we had a grand total of 2 hours that we talked about sexual violence in the academy. And that entire 2 hours was solely focused on criminal law. What were the statutes? How do they apply? All of that. Nowhere in the academy did we talk about how to respond and have a conversation with the survivor, what information we needed to get, like how we communicate with survivors. We didn't talk about those things. And I do remember very clearly the first time that I was out on my own, had gone through FTO and was working solo, getting a call to go to the hospital to make a rape report. I had no idea what I was doing, no clue. I could tell you what the law was, but I had no idea how to communicate. And so training is so, so important. And I'm super happy to say that we're up to 8 hours now in our police academy, which is still not enough, but it's much better than 2 hours. And currently we spend about 15 or 20 minutes talking about the legal aspects of rape. And the rest of that time, we talk about the neurobiology of trauma. We talk about how to respond to different kinds of scenes, how do we take this information, how do we communicate in a victim-centered manner. It's all geared towards communication. And so training is huge. Training our law enforcement officers to understand trauma, how to have a victim-centered approach, how to communicate, how to document, how to properly write a police report in context of crimes against person cases. Training is absolutely critical in building advocacy into the police culture.
And then building on that training is collaboration. So advocate involvement needs to be really deeply embedded into daily operations. There need to be designated officers who know how to connect with the advocates. There needs to be a real foundation of communication so that all of the training that officers are receiving, and it is not enough, but that training that they're receiving needs to be reinforced with communication with advocates in the day-to-day, talking about what they learned, talking about trauma-informed approaches, talking about the right language to use when they're writing a report or they're talking to a survivor. All of these things really need to be enforced on a day-to-day basis and built up through constant communication and collaboration with advocates.
Yeah. And then thirdly is partnerships. Having strong partnerships with other victim service agencies, your hospitals, other service providers in your community. Having those partnerships only strengthen not only the investigation, the response, the accountability of perpetrators. When we're working together collaboratively, we can accomplish so much more. This is one of those areas where it's really important that we tear down some silos. We tend to all work in our own little world and take care of our own little piece of the pie. And when we do that, oftentimes we end up duplicating services. We put the victim through multiple steps that could be reduced or taken out if we just had those partnerships that we were actually working together. We were all on the same page together. So partnerships are a big part. This is where our SART teams, COSAR teams, community-based type teams like that come into play. It's also really important, I think. Do you want to talk about ethical shifts?
Yeah, that's just what I was about to do.
Yeah.
So advocates really help to shift the culture of a police agency from purely investigative focus to one that's really prioritizing compassion and understanding. And that can be particularly important in these types of investigations. But I think it also sets up a system of more transparency and accountability within the agency. It helps to prioritize a sense of officers taking care of themselves. It tends to prioritize the community a little bit more in a wider sense, not just focused on sex crimes investigations, but how do we connect better with our community? How do we hold ourselves accountable when something goes wrong? How do do we address, incidents that may not be ideal for our department? And then it comes to an approach of a lot of agencies look at sexually based offenses as PR problems. And I've certainly consulted with organizations and security departments that think of it more as a PR problem. If someone experiences sexual violence, sexual harassment, they want to cover it up and smooth it over in the public eye as quickly as possible. And that's not the most ethical or compassionate approach. Clearly, what you need to do is review your policies and your best practices and figure out where things are, leaving loopholes where this type of behavior is occurring and you're not able to address and respond and prevent it. So I think the ethical shift that advocacy focus brings is really critically important to a police agency.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I also think improved officer morale is a part of this as well. Officers benefit from having advocates to help manage the emotional and the psychological needs of our victims, which helps to reduce burnout of our officers. I'm telling you, as an investigator, especially having advocates that are checking in, have information, can have case updates, that can share that with our survivors, is really important. It certainly helps me because I'm not working just one case. I've got, 20 cases going on at one time here. And so if I've got, multiple survivors calling and want to know where things are at on their case, having an advocate there that helps build some of that for me and can help provide updates and speak with the survivor certainly helps me be able to focus on the investigative side of things, as well as honestly takes a little bit of the emotional toll off of me as well. So let's do this one real quickly. So what steps could a department or would a department take to integrate advocacy more fully into their operations? What are some steps that we could take? Are there any agencies that are on that have fully integrated advocacy into daily operations that they can share kind of how that transition occurred or how's it working in your agency?
It sounds like Katrina said that we do, but I know she might not be able to unmute right now. So.
Yeah. Okay.
So I can share from the advocate perspective.
Yeah.
In years past, we have the lethality assessment program that we've worked out how to work with our local law enforcement around that, where whenever, they respond to a domestic violence call, they will do a lethality screen and call an advocate in that moment. So that's been really great. But I also think just reminding and encouraging law enforcement, if they respond to a sexual assault call or have someone come in to make a report, that advocates can absolutely respond to the police department in that moment too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, it's Katrina.
Hey.
I can also, share that my role is fully integrated here in our police department as well. I've been here for 14 years. I started out as a 1-year grant funded position, and now I'm fully funded by the department. I serve all of our officers and detectives. We have about 150 to 60 or so sworn officers. So I work both with patrol on their cases and detectives on their cases. And it really just depends on a lot of different factors. Obviously, one person can't serve all the cases that come in. I get anywhere from 5 to 30 new cases in my queue every day. So there's definitely a triage and a prioritization system in there. But my role has been fully integrated into our department with all of our different divisions.
Awesome.
That's
Katrina,
great to hear.
you may not be able to because it sounds like your caseload is crazy, that many new cases per day. But if you don't mind me asking, do you get an opportunity to ever do any type of training with your officers?
Yes, I do.
Awesome.
That's part of my role. Part of my role is direct advocacy. And, I'll go back and I'll say, I do not touch every single case that comes into our department.
Yeah.
It's prioritized by high lethality, by likelihood of happening again, type of victimization, and barriers that people face in participation in the system. So there's a lot of cases that I don't even have any contact with. And because one person can't do everything, a huge component of my role is training. So I have 3 hours with every new patrol officer who comes through our department. And then I do regular ongoing briefing trainings and in-service trainings for our officers, as needed.
Awesome. That's great. Super
And I
happy.
know you said you'd been in your position for 14 years. What did that position exist before you came to the department?
No, it did not.
Okay. And what kind of training, do you know what kind of training they were getting at that time?
I don't know. I think it was provided by our training division at that time. When they first hired for my position, they hired someone who, they hired and then they didn't pass the background check. So then they put an officer into the role as advocate. And obviously that was not successful because we operate in very amazingly compatible, but also incredibly different lanes.
Exactly.
So I was the first non-sworn civilian person who actually made it into my role. Prior to that, I think, we've had some community partners that we've had really close relationships with, our Sexual Assault Resource Center, Domestic Violence Resource Center, and other similar agencies that have come in and provided briefing trainings. But it definitely, 14 years ago was a very different culture in our agency. When I first started, I had some of our older school officers who, were closer to retirement, who were like, you shouldn't have a job here. And I don't know why we have an advocate in a police department and you shouldn't be here. And it's, and that, to that, it's like, well, thank you for your opinion. At least I know exactly where we stand together. And, since then we've had nearly complete, I would say that 50 to 60% of our current officers have been on the job for less than 5 years. We've just had an incredible number of retirements and new hires. And it's a very different culture where our officers are more trained and more empowered to do those initial connections and resources and referrals right on scene with people than they were when I first arrived here.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad they have you. And I would say that's probably also a big reflection of having you there in that role, because that's certainly not every department. So I'm very glad they have you there.
Yeah. Thank you for sticking that out for 14 years, making it through those initial, several years to get it to where it's at today. Kudos to you.
Thank you. I love it.
And we'll talk more about this particular topic a little bit later on as well, but we've got a system-based advocate that works in the Little Rock Police Department here in Arkansas. And she's kind of like you. She's the OG, if you will, in system-based advocacy for their agency. Sorry, UPS is pulling up. It's probably going to get loud for a second, so I'm going to put Kristen next slide.
So
Can I interrupt with a question?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just wonder, I don't know the Oregon victim rights for Oregon quite as well as I do Washington, but I'm curious, is that in Washington that's among the victim rights, and I'm guessing that is in Oregon too, and having officers awareness about that being responsible to know victim rights. Does that kind of help with those communications and relationships? I don't know if that's a component of Oregon. So maybe Katrina or somebody more experienced in the state than I can answer that question.
Yeah, and I'm happy to jump in as well. Just from like the Oregon, it is the same. And I think it just varies county to county. While like folks know those should know those like victims' rights. I would say that it just does vary agency to agency whether what sort of like weight they hold and what relationship building has taken place between those different like members at the table. And so I think, yeah, it does vary depending on the agency in Oregon.
Thanks, Haley. So next we have a scenario, which is sitting across from 8-year-old Mia, who had disclosed to her mother that a family friend had been forcing her to do things that made her feel weird and scared. Detective Jamie Reynolds felt the weight of the silence between them. Despite his gentle questions and efforts to build rapport, Mia remained unresponsive, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jamie knew that gaining information from child victims required more than the standard investigation techniques. It demanded specialized skills tailored to a child's developmental stage and emotional state. He wanted to get the information he needed, but he didn't want to risk re-traumatizing Mia. What should Jamie do next?
I think this one's an interesting one because it's a kiddo, and a lot of times in Oregon, kiddos will go to child advocacy centers and get forensically interviewed there. So I think it might vary based on what's available in your county here, what the next step would be.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of child advocacy centers in Oregon have in-house advocates too.
Yeah, I think the answer that I'm gleaning from both of your answers is bring in an advocate or there would be an advocate on site. And that's exactly the response that we were looking for. Did anyone else want to chime in on that before we move to the next slide?
I apologize. UPS pulled up a while ago and I didn't get to, it got very noisy for a moment, but I'll come back to my point here in just a little bit. We'll talk more about that last topic.
All right. So how do advocates enhance investigations? The first point is that they offer emotional and psychological support. Advocates help victims to feel comfortable and willing to engage with law enforcement.
Yeah, they also, advocates can model specialized expertise that police departments may not inherently provide officers. So we talked a little bit about that a while ago as well. Also modeling those behaviors, modeling the trauma-informed approach to where an officer may not have that training. Also, vital information. They provide background on victims' emotional state, ensuring that investigators approach interviews with sensitivity.
And lastly, they help to build trust, as we've been talking about throughout the presentation. One of the key elements of an advocate's job is to build that trust with the survivor and lead to more successful investigations and prosecutions, as well as minimizing re-traumatization and making sure that they feel supported and get the resources that they need.
So some key tools that we could utilize, the first of which is soft interview rooms. Just out of curiosity, how many that are on the call today, show of hands, have access to soft interview rooms?
I just toured one at the Bend Police Department, so they have a nice one.
Awesome. Awesome. That's great. So I can just share from my own experience with this in Arkansas. So, most of my career that I was in law enforcement, we did not have soft interview rooms. We used the standard police, interview room or interrogation room, whatever you want to refer it to. But, it's just a very small, bleak room with a table and two chairs and a video camera. That was pretty much what we had. So, not very victim friendly whatsoever. What really changed that in Arkansas, at least, was our child advocacy centers. Child advocacy centers started developing soft interview rooms for children interviews, for forensic interview with children. that looked very much like a playroom at home. It had, carpet and bright colors and books and toys and beanbag chairs and all of the things that just help the child to have a more comfortable and more familiar environment. And we began to see a huge turnover on how much information we were able to get from these interviews based on the environment, and also in context with having a forensic interviewer who is trained to interview children. Those two components put together, we're getting so much more and able to prosecute these cases so much more effectively. So we took that information and we began to apply it to adult interviews as well. And so across the state of Arkansas, for example, we've got interview rooms. Some of them are located in law enforcement agencies. Some of them are located in advocacy agencies that law enforcement has 24-hour access to. But we have these soft interview rooms that really just look like your living room at home. They've got, furniture, and they have couches and chairs and lamps and pictures on the wall and curtains and rugs and the whole nine yards. And it is just a much more relaxing environment, much more normalized environment to have these kind of interactions, these kind of conversations in, versus a cold, sterile interview room at a police department. Because it doesn't matter if you're 9 years old or you're 79 years old. It doesn't take very long sitting in an interview room in a police department before you feel like a suspect. That's what those rooms are kind of designed for.
And along the same lines of normalizing things as much as possible, making things as comfortable as possible, is the way that we use language and body language when we're taking a report or completing an investigation or an interview. We always want to introduce ourselves in a way that is humanizing and relatable to the survivor. So rather than introducing yourself as, say, I'm Officer Daly, I'm here to take the report, I would say, hi, I'm Kristen. I'm here to talk with you about what happened today. And, not necessarily having your badge or your gun on display can go a long way in creating more of a sense of comfortability with the survivor. I think another really important one for advocates, and I know everyone on this call is probably more than aware, but choosing your words carefully in mirroring the victim's language. So for example, if someone says rape, I use rape. If someone says, when he hurt me, I say, can you tell me more about what you remember when he was hurting you? We always want to make sure that we are mirroring that language to ensure that we are not only listening and hearing what they're saying, but to be sure that what the language we're using is reflective of their experience. And Kenny, I know that we both really love to talk about language. So if you have more to add to that before we move to transparency, please chime in.
Yeah, no, I could talk about language forever. So I will not today. That's a whole other topic. I will just add on the body language side of that though. Both as a patrol officer and as a detective, we only get one first impression. And that first impression is a key component of what happens in this investigation. As a patrol officer, if you're the first officer on scene, that officer has the power and the ability to help thrust this investigation forward by having a good first impression with that victim that they feel empowered, or not empowered necessarily, but feel supported and heard, versus you're just there to take a report, no empathy, no compassion, and they feel not heard. They don't feel like anyone cares. The chances of them moving forward is reduced greatly. And so that first impression really is a critical component of body language and things of that nature. Yes, I could talk language for a long time, so I'll digress on it. I'm going to move to transparency instead. I'll be transparent and say I could talk about that forever. Transparency, though, when we're talking about transparency, really what we're talking about here is just keeping the survivor informed as to the processes and the why behind what we're doing. Keeping them understanding what happens next in this process and why that's happening, as well as, in an investigation, especially in an investigative interview, whether it be with a detective, whether it be with a prosecutor, we have to ask some pretty hard questions sometimes. We have to ask some very personal questions sometimes. And so just being transparent and explaining why we're asking the questions that we're asking and why we're asking them in the way that we're asking them could be very beneficial to the healing of the survivor and the understanding of the process and the whole investigative outcome at the end. So
Yeah, the way that I like to think about that and articulate it to officers is think about a situation where you are feeling nervous or afraid about the outcome. Say you think you might be in trouble at work and your boss sends you a G-chat message and asks you for a phone call without giving you any kind of context, or say, your partner calls you and says, "We need to talk when I get home." Going into it, if you're going in blind, that's likely to put you more on edge, and less likely to put you in a place to really reflect and answer the questions in a way that's most useful for the investigation. If you give some context, like your boss sends you that message and says, "I want to get clarification on this data report. Can we have a quick call?" That puts you in a way different frame of mind to have the conversation. And this is a very elevated and more serious version of that situation. Explaining the steps and explaining why you're asking what you're asking can really change the whole tone of the interaction.
yeah, absolutely. Kind of a funny example of this off the cuff is my boss at work. It's a running joke now, but when I first got hired on, if I was to ask a question of my boss, she answers a lot through text message, and so I would ask, "Hey, is it okay if I take off next Thursday?" And her reply would just be one word, and it was "sure." And I never knew how to take that. I never knew was like, is that sure? Yeah, take off. It's no problem. Not an issue. Or it's like, sure, go ahead, just take off work. I don't care. Whatever you're going to do it anyway, or you're going to do what, like, I never understood what sure meant. And so, so now it's a kind of a running joke. Anytime I ask a question, she always texts me and says sure. But having that transparency would have been a lot, that we're talking about here, of that feeling of like, I don't know what's going to happen or what is meant by this. So yeah, absolutely. So there are some internal challenges when we talk about system-based advocacy. We kind of alluded to this a while ago. One of those is resistance to change itself. So sometimes law enforcement agencies may be reluctant to embrace advocates due to traditional views, as law enforcement and victim advocacy is two separate things. I know that in my experience, for a very long time, especially when advocacy was kind of new in our area and we didn't really understand what advocacy was. Law enforcement was very closed off. We did not want we did not want an advocate or anyone else for that matter sitting in an interview room with us, sitting at the hospital while we're taking a police report. Those were things that we had never experienced before, and those were like big no-nos for us in law enforcement. And we had to learn that it is helping us more than it is harming us. It's not harming us at all. As a matter of fact, it's so beneficial for both the survivor in the situation and for us in law enforcement, doing this investigation. So resistance to change is a problem that you may run into. A solution would be start with a small pilot program or an advocacy liaison that demonstrates the value of what an advocacy can bring to that agency. So that, I also think that if you start with your multidisciplinary group, and you start building that relationship and that rapport through that system, when you introduce the system into the law enforcement agency, you will already have those foundations laid and those bonds built. Will make that transition a lot easier as well.
Say you've started that pilot program or brought in a multidisciplinary team and you're starting to integrate advocates into your agency, the next biggest challenge comes in balancing the roles. So I think it was Amber mentioned earlier in the call, sometimes those lines can get blurred between the role of the police officer or investigator and the advocate because, there is a sense of first of all, kind of ownership of the case. The officer wants to, outline how things are going to proceed. They want to, have overview of everything that's happening, and gather all the information. At the same time, they also want to, we're human beings. We want to provide a sense of support to the survivor, but we can't be all things to all people. And I think advocates are really great at maintaining those boundaries within working within a law enforcement environment. We want to always be conscious of the potential tensions that can arise when roles overlap or conflict. And we need to know what the boundaries are and what our kind of designated roles are, where the lines are. So the solution would be to really clearly define the roles, what an advocate is there to do, what they're not there to do. Kenny mentioned a bit earlier, you don't want the advocate chiming in during the interview and asking the questions when the officer is interviewing. You don't want necessarily the officer calling and checking in on the survivor and offering resources that a victim might have, better access, better knowledge of, a better way to provide. So really clearly in your policy or in your practices, defining the roles and ensuring that both advocates and officers understand the limits and the boundaries of their responsibilities and who is responsible for what when it comes to working with the survivor can kind of eliminate the potential for tension at the outset.
Yeah. I really don't know what this last one, this funding and resources, why that's even on here, because I mean, we all have plenty of money and resources to deal with. So grants are abundant. So but not sure why we have this on here, but
We're all just rolling in it.
yeah, just for fun, right? But no, I mean, funding is a huge problem, right? We all have funding crisis. I mean, right now, across the country, we're in a huge funding crisis with a lot of our programs, VOCA cuts and all sorts of different things that are happening. So how do we address this? How do we, if we're having a shortfall with trying to implement a system-based advocate into a law enforcement agency, where do we find the money for that? Grants are one of those ways, but those are, as we know, are harder and harder to come across and sustain. So, this is, in my opinion, at least, this is an investment that your city or your county agency should be going to their city council or their quorum court or their local county government, requesting that be a part of the line item budget for that agency. It should be fully supported by the agency, not necessarily or thereof, a combination of grants and city or county funding. But this is an incredibly important role. So providing data, going back and generating reports of how many cases are coming in and being worked. What is the prosecution rates? Looking at all sorts of data points that could help support the need for a county or the city government to be able to hire and support having a system-based advocacy within the agency, and how having that advocacy there is going to help reduce, whether it be the caseload or increase the prosecution rate and accountability for offenders. Do you have anything else, Kristen, on this one?
Yep.
Okay.
Ready for the next.
All right.
So the external challenges, clearly one of the biggest hurdles to overcome in an external sense is skepticism from the community. So some members of the community may be distrustful of law enforcement collaboration with advocates, especially if there is a history of contentious relationships or, those communities that are really disproportionately impacted by the system. There is a natural hesitancy to get directly involved with police or to be skeptical of advocates who are working directly with the police agency. In my day job, a lot of the work that we do is pairing police with community members directly to collaborate on community-based solutions that change agency policy or practice. And I think that is really building toward A, trust, and B, a shared responsibility for public safety, which is hugely important for community well-being. But one of the most obvious and natural solutions is to conduct outreach programs that really educate the community on the role of advocacy within agencies and how it helps survivors and improves the justice process and access to the process. So creating that shared approach to public safety, the community needs to lead that. Communities' needs and community voices need to be front and center and come directly from the community. And the more that we can prioritize that within agencies, and advocates are a great kind of bridge to build there, as we've been talking about, that really sets us up for success in terms of overall public safety, community health and safety, community well-being.
Yeah. Another external challenge also is coordinating across agencies. This is, I mentioned this a while ago, I believe, where we oftentimes work in silos so much in victim services that we end up duplicating services. And so we have our survivor having to go through different processes through different agencies that are probably doing the exact same things. And so we're duplicating. This is a great place to, if you do not have a multidisciplinary team, to start a multidisciplinary team, or if you do have one, this is a great place to go back and revisit. Sometimes our teams become stagnant. We work on cases, we work on different things, and sometimes we forget just some of the basic things that we're supposed to do, and that is checking in with one another and kind of reviewing each other's roles and our procedures and things of that nature to ensure that we're all working fluidly together, and we're not doing those duplication of services. But this is another challenge that we can face as well. Kristen, just so you know, we're 8 minutes.
So we want to talk about the advocate's impact on agency culture. First of all, we mentioned earlier promoting ethical conduct. Advocates can really help in the creation of ethical guidelines, focusing on treating victims with dignity and respect throughout the investigative process. And this will result in stronger community relationships, more focus on transparency and accountability, and ultimately increased trust in law enforcement.
Yeah, another big part too is building a more compassionate agency. Advocates play a huge role in this through different aspects. Number one, they can play a role through training. We heard from one of our participants a while ago that helps provide that training within their agency. This helps officers understand the broader context of crime and trauma, and how that trauma affects survivors' behavior and memory and different aspects like that. And so that's a huge part of it, as well as it helps to shape the agency culture. I can tell you that if you have a law enforcement agency that does not have a trauma-informed culture, having a victim advocate there is going to be very, very challenging. We heard a while ago, and I'm terrible with names, and I can't see her name on here now, but our advocate that's been there for 14 years, I give her kudos for sticking that out, because it didn't sound like the culture was all that great when she started there to where it is today. And so she was instrumental in changing law enforcement culture within that department. And that is huge and something to be very, very proud of, because that's one of the powers that advocates have, is to be able to change the culture within an agency. I'll give you a brief example. This is what I was going to talk about when my dog went crazy a while ago, is that, so we have an advocate that she's one of the original, advocates at the Little Rock Police Department. And she has built such an amazing rapport with officers over, 20 plus years of being there, that she is now entrusted with every sexual assault, every rape case that it comes through the agency. The initial police report comes to her desk before it goes to a sergeant's desk or a captain's desk or another, supervisor's desk. She reads every report first. Because she asked for that, because she was seeing these police reports and they were atrocious. They were not victim centered. The language was terrible. And so she started training officers how to write reports. And now she's the first line of defense. When a report comes in, she gets to read it first and say, no, this is not going to cut it. You need to redo this or whatever. She's been able to build that. So that's really huge. But on the flip side of that, I've also seen law enforcement agencies where we had a good advocate. The advocate that was working there, was hired, was a good advocate, but the environment was so toxic at that law enforcement agency that within a year working there, that good advocate had adopted the same mindset as the law enforcement officers, and was doing more harm than good at that point with victims. And so we have to be really careful. It can go both directions in that.
Yeah, it definitely can. And I think a big part of that culture is not putting a prioritization on officer well-being and wellness. And advocates can really help officers to manage emotional stress, provide resources for coping with trauma that they encounter every day, and really help to create a culture where prioritizing mental health is destigmatized. And we're going to talk about that a bit more in a second, but so we'll pause for there.
Yeah, so let's do one last interactive discussion real quick. So, in your agency, how could the presence of advocates change the dynamic between officers and the community?
And that might be a little difficult for folks to answer, as I think a majority are advocates on this call. I think everyone else had to
Yes.
step away because they were active.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can skip over on that if no one has anything to add, but if you do, please feel free to jump in quickly.
We're running short on time anyway, so we'll
Yeah.
skip past that one. Go on to the next.
So self-care and the challenge of compassion fatigue. The key step here, first of all, is recognizing burnout. Advocates, like police officers, like most of us who are practitioners, face the emotional toll of working with survivors of trauma every day. And compassion fatigue can really impair their ability to help others. So we want to be really hyper aware of recognizing the signs of burnout in ourselves and in our colleagues.
Yeah,
And
and
then, oh, go ahead.
well, I just wanted to add on that, get agency support real quickly. I wanted to add to that because as a law enforcement agency, we also need to recognize the incredible demand, both emotionally and psychologically, that is being placed on our advocates as well. And so we need to be able to recognize the signs of burnout and trauma with our advocates that are there as well, because they do a great job doing that for us, but we got to be able to do that for them as well.
Absolutely. And that takes us right into self-care strategies, which is, we need to encourage advocates to take time off, to have some downtime, to not be on the clock 24/7, to practice mindfulness, to really engage in things like peer support groups, and to provide easy access to counseling and mental health resources and sources of support. So how are you taking care of you? Um, the purpose here is to think about self-care as not selfish, but as essential in doing our jobs and continuing our paths as practitioners. So there are a lot of potential impacts of burnout and stress and trauma. We want to be really aware. We want to be conscious and mindful of physical, mental, and emotional health. We don't want to play down our stress. We want to be sure that we focus on connection, not to isolate or shut down. To make sure that we're going to therapy, asking for support from peers and colleagues and family and friends, making sure to ask for help when we need it and to take breaks when we need them, to really focus on balance, taking time for ourselves, making sure that we're practicing grounding or journaling or physical activity, meditation. All of these are tools that advocates and officers mutually can use to mitigate some of the signs of burnout and stress. And we also really want to be sure that there's a focus on acknowledging that there's always a lot of information to process and unpack in this field. So to do a job that requires you to be really exposed to trauma over and over and day in and day out and help people through what is likely the worst day of their lives. To some degree, a lot of us probably really compartmentalize that. And there's not always time to process everything in the moment, but the really critical question is, how are we taking care of ourselves? How are you taking care of you in this space? Because the trauma response that we see in survivors that we're working with a lot of us are experiencing that ourselves as well. Vicarious trauma is real. It's a real thing, and it's a serious thing. It's emotional residue from repeated exposure to trauma that others are experiencing, and it changes our view of the world. It can make us feel really worn down. A lot of this potential symptoms of that are feeling emotionally numb or detached, or trouble sleeping, nightmares, irritable, angry, anxious for no reason, sparking intrusive thoughts, making us feel hopeless, and then physical symptoms like headaches and fatigue. So all of these are things that there's a high potential for both police officers and advocates to experience. And it is really important to take yourself back to that awareness, connection, and balance, and learn how to find ways to cope with all of that, and always seek help when you need it.
Self-care is so important. So as we wrap up, just provide some practical steps to cultivate advocacy in your agency. Number one, develop a strategic plan. Like, know what the plan is. You've got to be able to have some sort of foundational place to start at. So, identify key stakeholders, define what the roles are going to be, and establish goals for the advocacy program as a whole. What are the goals and objectives of this program? Secondly, training and support. Create a training curriculum for both the advocate and for officers. Both are equally as important. We want to ensure ongoing professional development for advocates to keep them informed about best practices and trauma-informed care, and that rolls over to law enforcement officers as well. Then lastly, monitor and evaluate. Track the effectiveness of advocacy programs and adjust as needed. Gather feedback from survivors, from the advocates, from the officers, from community members and stakeholders to assess the impact. This is where, maybe you're starting off that this is a grant-funded program. This is the critical information that you can be collecting in the first year or two of that program that could roll that over to being a fully funded program through the city or the county agency.
So ultimately, building advocacy into your agency creates a more trauma-informed environment externally and internally, and it helps improve outcomes for survivors, foster a culture of compassion and service, and prioritize well-being. And we want to really place a lot of emphasis on the value of that compassion, and that survivor-centered approach, and the positive ripple effects that can potentially have, not only on investigations, but on community relations as well. So we really encourage all of you to reflect on how you can integrate or strengthen advocacy programs within your agency, or if you are advocates, think about ideas for strengthening those programs, strengthening those relationships, and start small, build partnerships, and create lasting change.
Yeah, so a big shout out to those that are on here that already are doing this work, that are system-based advocates now, who've been doing the work for a very long time. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It is amazing. You're making a huge difference, not only in the lives of the survivors that you're serving, but also the officers and the administration and the culture of the agency of which you work. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Those that maybe are not system-based advocates, or maybe you're in law enforcement and do not have system-based advocates just yet. First, thank you for being here today. This is a great first step, learning more information about this and supporting it. And hopefully it's something that is encouraging that you want to work towards within your own agency, of being able to find a way, an avenue or a path to be able to have system-based advocacy in your agency. So thank you guys all for being here. We certainly appreciate you. And so our time is up for the day. So our mission will be complete for now until we meet again. But thank you guys so much. We'll open the floor for any kind of questions or comments at this time.
We do appreciate all you advocates hanging in there with us as we go through a lot of information you may already know. But maybe this can potentially be a path to having conversations within your agency or with the agency within your community.